In 64 AD, an old man named Peter was dragged into the circus of Nero in Rome. He was stripped, beaten, and crucified upside down. A few years later, Paul was beheaded. James was thrown from the top of the temple. These men weren't criminals. They were witnesses, and they died in agony, refusing to recant one single claim: that they saw a man named Jesus walk out of his grave alive. Skeptics will tell you the resurrection is a legend that evolved over hundreds of years, or a lie invented by power-hungry zealots to start a new religion. But history tells a different story. People will die for a religion they believe is true. We see that all the time. But nobody dies for a lie they know they invented. So what actually happened in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago? And why does the evidence point to the one conclusion that science says is impossible? To solve this, we have to look at it like a cold case detective. When you strip away the theology and the stained glass windows, you are left with a historical event. A man died. 3 days later, his tomb was empty. And a few weeks later, thousands of people in the very city where he was executed began worshipping him as God. Logically, there are really only 3 explanations for how this happened. Option 1. It's a legend. The story started small and got exaggerated over decades until a carpenter became a god. Option 2. It's a lie. The disciples stole the body and made the whole thing up. Or option 3. It actually happened. Most of the modern world sits comfortably in option 1 or 2. It feels safer. It aligns with our understanding of the natural world. But when you actually test those theories against the data we have from the 1st century, they start to crumble, and the cracks begin with the tomb itself. There is a strange fact about the resurrection that often gets overlooked. The movement started in Jerusalem. This is critical. If I wanted to start a fake religion about a man rising from the dead, I wouldn't do it in the city where he was buried. I'd go to Rome, or Athens, somewhere far away where nobody could check my facts. But the disciples started preaching the resurrection in Jerusalem, just a short walk from the tomb. If the body was still in there, the Jewish authorities or the Romans could have crushed Christianity in 5 minutes. All they had to do was roll away the stone, pull out the body, and parade it through the streets. Game over. Christianity dies right there. But they didn't do that. Why? Because they couldn't. Even the enemies of Jesus admitted the tomb was empty. In Matthew 28, the religious leaders don't deny the tomb is empty. They claim the disciples stole the body. This is what historians call enemy attestation. When your enemy admits a fact that hurts their case, it's almost certainly true. So we know the tomb was empty. The question is, how did it get that way? Let's look at the legend theory. This is the idea that Jesus was a great moral teacher, but over 100 years, the game of telephone turned him into a deity. This makes sense on the surface. We see this with figures like Alexander the Great or Buddha, where miracles are attributed to them centuries later. But the timeline for Jesus doesn't allow for it. We actually have a smoking gun document that destroys the legend theory. It's found in the letter of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. The Apostle Paul wrote this letter around 55 AD, roughly 25 years after Jesus died. But in the letter he quotes a creed, a structured oral tradition, that he says he received from the earlier disciples. Scholars, including skeptical atheist historians like Gerd Ludemann, date this creed to within 2 to 3 years of the crucifixion. Some say months. This creed lists the eyewitnesses: Peter, the 12, 500 brothers at once, James and Paul. This means the core claim, Jesus died, was buried, and rose again, wasn't a legend that developed later. It was the very first thing the Christians said. It was there from the beginning. You cannot have a legend grow up while the eyewitnesses are still alive to shut it down. It would be like me trying to convince you today that John F. Kennedy walked out of his grave in 1963. There are too many people still alive who would say, no, he didn't. So if it wasn't a legend, was it a calculated lie? This brings us to the lie theory. Maybe the disciples were master conspirators. Maybe they stole the body to keep the movement alive. But to believe this, you have to ignore everything we know about human psychology. Chuck Colson was the special counsel to President Richard Nixon. He was known as Nixon's hatchet man and went to prison for his role in the Watergate scandal. He later became a Christian, and he had a fascinating insight into conspiracies. He said, "Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. You're telling me 12 apostles could keep alive for 40 years? Absolutely impossible." Think about what the disciples gained from this lie. When people start cults or fake religions, they do it for 3 reasons: money, sex, or power. What did the disciples get? They were beaten, stoned, imprisoned, and executed. They lived in poverty and constant fear. Paul was decapitated, Peter was crucified, Thomas was speared to death in India. Liars make up stories to get out of trouble, not to get into it. If the resurrection was a lie, Peter knew it. So when the Roman soldiers were nailing him to the cross, all he had to do was say, "Stop, it was a prank. We stole the body." He could have saved his life, but he didn't. He died claiming it was true. That kind of sustained conviction under persecution is hard to explain if they knew it was a lie, but the evidence gets even stranger. If you were writing a fiction story in the 1st century and you wanted people to believe it, there are certain things you would never include. You would never make women your first witnesses. In 1st century Jewish culture, a woman's testimony was considered so unreliable it wasn't even admissible in a court of law. Josephus, a historian from that time, actually wrote, "Let not the testimony of women be admitted." Yet all 4 Gospels say that women were the first ones to find the empty tomb. Mary Magdalene, not Peter, was the first to see the risen Jesus. If the disciples were making this up to look good, they would have written that Peter found the tomb. Or John, the only reason to include the embarrassing detail of the women is if it actually happened. And then there's James. James was the brother of Jesus. The Gospels tell us that during Jesus' life, James didn't believe in him. In fact, John 7 says his brothers thought he was crazy. Imagine what it would take to convince you that your own brother was God. It would take a lot. Yet shortly after the crucifixion, James becomes the leader of the church in Jerusalem. Josephus records that James was eventually stoned to death for his faith in his brother. What changed a skeptic into a martyr? 1 Corinthians 15 gives us the simple answer: then he appeared to James. So where does that leave us? We have an empty tomb that even the enemies admitted was empty. We have a creed dating back to the very beginning, destroying the legend theory. We have embarrassing details that no liar would invent. And we have a group of terrified men who suddenly became fearless martyrs, willing to die for what they saw. Skeptics have tried to explain this away for 2,000 years. They've suggested the swoon theory, that Jesus didn't really die on the cross. But Roman executioners were professionals. They didn't break legs unless the victim was alive, and they pierced Jesus' side to ensure death. They've suggested the hallucination theory, that the disciples were grief-stricken and imagined him. But hallucinations are individual, internal experiences. They don't happen to groups of people at the same time, and they certainly don't happen to 500 people at once. And hallucinations don't eat fish, like Jesus did with the disciples. When you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. The resurrection is not just a matter of blind faith. It's a matter of historical evidence. The disciples didn't die for a metaphor. They didn't die for a moral teaching. They died because they went to a tomb on a Sunday morning and found it empty. And that empty tomb changes everything. Jesus Christ is the one true Messiah. Thanks for joining the Gospel Evidence. Come back for more biblical myths, facts, and stories of faith.